Very warm welcome and good afternoon from Vienna, but also a very good morning and good evening to hundreds of participants from around the world who have decided to join this webinar today. We are pleased to have you with us and thank you for your interest and time. I'm Adnan Šerić. I'm a research economist at UNIDO's Policy Research and Statistics Department, and I will moderate today's event that is a first in a series of planned webinars to discuss the future of industrialization in a post-pandemic world. Today's event is organized in partnership with the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and the Kiel Centre for Globalization in Germany. It is our joint pleasure to present you with a stellar lineup of speakers and panelists who will share their views and insights on the future of global production networks in the aftermath of COVID-19 crisis. As most of us will already know, the spread of global production networks, or alternatively global value chains, have been one of defining features of globalization in the post-Cold War era, and certainly one of the key drivers of economic growth and prosperity in many parts of the world. COVID-19, along with other emerging global trends such as industry adoption of advanced digital production technologies and processes, are now challenging those established structures and pose serious questions about their future viability. Over the coming hour, we aim to debate and hopefully deepen our understanding of those issues through a lively online discussion. As for the format and structure of this webinar, we will kick off with brief opening remarks to set the scene, followed by interventions from our esteemed panel, which I will introduce at a slightly later stage, and ending with a Q&A session. You will have the option to interact with the speakers in this final segment of the session. To do so, please directly address your questions to the speaker or speakers by clicking on the Q&A button located below your Zoom video screen. We now start with the opening remarks delivered by UNIDO's Deputy to the Director General and Managing Director of the Directorate of External Relations and Policy Research, Mr. Hiroshi Kuniyoshi. Mr. Kuniyoshi, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Distinguished fellow speakers, dear webinar participants from around the world, I'm pleased to welcome you to this first in a series of webinars on the future of industrialization in a post-pandemic world. The idea behind the series is to inform the debate on the kind of urgent policy responses needed to tackle the unprecedented economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis. In today's online event, organized by UNIDO with the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and the Kiel Centre for Globalization, we hope to shed some light on the topic of global production networks in the aftermath of COVID-19. This is a key question that touches on the meaning of economic resilience, the role of future technologies, and the nature of globalization itself. Thanks to the technologies we connect, the physical distance is no barrier to participation. Our distinguished panelists will be joined by hundreds of participants who share the same concerns from 82 countries. Turning to the crisis itself, the numbers continue to make for grim reading. 10 million people are now known to have contracted the virus. 500,000 people have died. Behind these figures lies a human tragedy that is hard to fully comprehend. This tragedy is further compounded by a deep economic crisis that is putting even more lives at risk, with record unemployment and widespread business closures. 16 million more people might be pushed into extreme poverty. 1.6 billion people in the informal economy will be left without livelihoods. This kind of devastation is on a scale different from anything we have seen before. No country will be left unscathed, but the toll will be particularly dramatic on developing economies. In these circumstances, we must ask ourselves, what will be a path to an inclusive and sustainable economic recovery? It is difficult to give an appropriate, adequate answer to this question at present. But there are certain steps countries can take now to aid a swift economic recovery. The first needs to be ensuring that existing farms and industrial ecosystems are rescued. Secondly, we have a responsibility to put environmental sustainability at the center, at the heart of the recovery, making sure that the actions we take protect the planet. And beyond that, we must focus on the developing an inclusive and sustainable long-term recovery plan that helps us reach the goals agreed upon in 2030 agenda. These challenges cannot be faced alone. The impact of the pandemic has been immediate and ubiquitous, leaving people, businesses, and entire economies struggling to deal with the fallout. We must respond with equal speed, moved by a sense of joint purpose. We at UNIDO remain committed to continuing a close collaboration with member states and partners. It is our hope that today's discussions and future webinars will help to guide policy makers, practitioners, and researchers toward finding viable paths out of the crisis. As we work to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, let us all come together and turn the recovery from this pandemic into opportunity for building a better future. I look forward to a fruitful and lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind remarks, Mr. Kuniyoshi. We now look forward to listening to opening remarks by Professor Gabriel Felbermayr, who is the president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Professor Felbermayr currently holds a chair in economics and economic policy at the Kiel University. Professor Felbermayr, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adnan. Dear Hiroshi Kuniyoshi, dear friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I think the IMF in Washington is quite right when they say the corona crisis is a crisis like no other. It's true, this crisis does not result from the bursting of a bubble or from some major economic policy mistake. It stems from a global health shock, probably best compared to some natural disaster. It's a crisis like no other because it is more generalized geographically than any recession before. It essentially encompasses all sectors of economic activity, and it is much deeper than what we have seen for the last 90 years. Let us hope that we're talking about a 1 in 100 years event. Because of its systemic and deep character, the crisis will profoundly affect the global economy, even if production and demand bounce back quickly. The crisis is likely to change the structure and the patterns of the global division of labor, and in particular, it will affect global production networks. This webinar series, jointly organized by UNIDO and the Kiel Institute, is dedicated to improving our understanding of the shift that is going on and of the consequences of this shift for the manufacturing sector, for growth, for development all over the world. Even outside of massive crises, of course, the global production network has been in motion. Firms have constantly adjusted to lower trade barriers, to new countries joining the global economy, to new technologies. Firms have traded off the benefits of diversifying suppliers versus reduced economies of scale. And as their risk assessment changed over the course of time, they have adopted their behavior. This crisis will undoubtedly bring about a new wave of re-optimization, as strong variation in economic environments helps firms learn about the system that they are in. Possibly this readjustment speeds up and intensifies investments in the digitalization of logistics. It leads maybe to a further broadening of the supplier base of firms. It might induce more stockpiling, and as a consequence, it might well yield more resilient makers around the world, including in my own country, seem to be convinced that political action is needed to reshape global value chains. Some politicians take the corona crisis as proof that our global system is too fragile, that we are too vulnerable, that we depend too much on others. Details of arguments may differ. Some argue that trade imbalances themselves are inherently unfair and need to be addressed if nothing else works, with the help of tariffs and other protectionist measures. Some say that global value chains need to become greener, and more generally, that they need to become more value-driven. Some stress the goals of strategic autonomy or technological sovereignty or the like, and they think subsidies are in order to achieve the desired independence. While these objectives, or some of them at least, might seem sensible enough at first sight, they do imply that production of final and intermediate goods should be brought closer to those places where consumption or input usage take place. Therefore, these arguments imply some policy-induced degree of deglobalization, some reduction in the division of labor, with potentially disastrous consequences for global productivity growth, and in particular for the catching up process of poorer countries. While these deglobalization policies are likely to slow global growth, they are quite unlikely to make our world more resilient to new crises. Quite the opposite. Colleagues have published work recently, for example, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, that make this point brilliantly clear. And at the Kiel Institute, we have put a couple of essays together in a little volume that we call The World Economy After the Coronavirus Crisis, Restarting Globalization, that puts more of these arguments together. I invite you to read this little volume. It's on our website. I've tweeted about it this morning. The crisis, in my view, is not a proof that globalization does not work. When all countries are hit by a highly correlated shock, more or less simultaneously, one cannot expect stabilization from international trade. But openness has certainly not been destabilizing itself. Rather, the true problems of our times are the erosion of trust between nations, the diminished influence of the rules-based multilateral order, and cooperation failures. Trust, I think, is the indispensable lubricant of global production chains. I'm sure that global institutions, including the UN Industrial Development Organization, do whatever they can to revive trust, this essential input in a working global order. And I'm also sure that our little webinar, thanks to a row of fantastic speakers, can help us understand a bit more about the future of global value chains, what is at stake, and what needs to be done. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Professor Felbermayr. Without any further ado, we will dive right into the main section of the webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce to you a panel of world-class experts on the subject topic. Professor Beata Jaworczyk is the chief economist of EBRD and currently on leave from University of Oxford, where she is a professor of economics. Professor Svenja Falk is a managing director with Accenture Research and honorary professor at the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. She's also a fellow at the Hertie School of Governance. Our next speaker is Professor Izumi Ono, who is the director of JICA Ogata Research Institute in Japan. Professor Ono has a long-standing experience and expertise in the areas of international development policy and industrial development cooperation, among others. Last but not least, we have Professor Harjun Chang with us, who is the director of the Center of Development Studies at the University of Cambridge and a fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, DC. Starting with Professor Jaworczyk. Over the past few weeks and months, a number of analysts and commentators have claimed that the pandemic may usher the end of globalization as we know it. Professor Felberweyer was just alluding to it. In your view, what is the likely impact of COVID-19 on the future of global trade and operations of global production networks in particular? Professor Jaworczyk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in this discussion on the future of global value chains. Let me share with you 3 observations I have on the subject. The one question that we are all thinking about at the moment is, to what extent will global value chains move away from just-in-time strategy to a just-in-case approach? So from cost optimization to resilience. Early in the pandemic, the world has realized just how dependent we are on China, how concentrated our supply base. Early in the pandemic, there was a survey done among Japanese investors in China, and half of them reported being affected by the lockdowns, but only a quarter of them had Plan B. Now, the pandemic has drawn attention in general to low probability events and to the fact that these events may be hitting us with an increased frequency as the climate change progresses. On top of that, we also have uncertainty about trade policy. The US-China trade war has not been resolved. The US-EU conflict may reignite. The World Trade Organization has been weakened. So firms may wish to think about how vulnerable their production chains are to those shocks that are likely to come back. And this may be reinforced by pressure from politicians. As we have heard from Professor Felberweyer, economic patriotism is something that on the minds of many politicians. Before, the US has been very vigorously pursuing the America First approach, but now actually in Europe, we hear voices. For instance, President Macron has recently talked about encouraging increased production in France and in Europe in general. Bailout of Renault was tied to the promise of bringing more value-added activities to France. So these pressures are likely to be mounted. Now, at the same time as many countries are leaving lockdowns, there is a temptation to go back to business as usual. On a recent panel, an executive of a European manufacturing firm located east of the European Union said, well, actually, in our case, the pandemic has not affected our supply chains. Instead, we were hit by a fire that happened in one of our supplying plants in northern Italy. So there will be this strong temptation to go back to business as usual. And this temptation is driven by the fact that building in resilience is costly. So firms will need to think about this trade-off between efficiency and resilience and think to what extent they want to move. My suspicion is that we are going to see some reshoring that is going to be possible thanks to automation, which means that labor costs are less important. We are also going to see some nearshoring, and this creates opportunities for countries that are not typically at the top of foreign investors lists. So for instance, if you think about the European context, this is an opportunity for Western Balkans, for North Africa, and for countries located further east of the EU. Now, the second point I want to draw your attention to is trade finance. In the times of growing uncertainty, like the times we're experiencing now, demand for insuring risks goes up, and trade is no exception. In the context of international trade, parties are concerned about not receiving payments for the goods they have shipped or not receiving goods they have prepaid. The EBRD is active in the trade finance space, and we have seen a big increase in demand for insurance. And actually, if you look at the data, you see that indeed trade flows that are insured through trade finance instruments, such as letters of credit, appear to have done better, appear to have been more resilient than other flows. In my slides, you see a chart which looks at exports of Turkey. Turkey is a good example, a good context to study this question for two reasons. First, Turkey did not experience a lockdown on weekdays, only on weekends, so there was no supply side shock. And second, Turkey collects very detailed information on the payment terms used in international trade transactions. So what you see in this chart is that Turkish exports on cash in advance terms, which are also known as pay and pray, that you receive the goods, have experienced a decline of about 40% in March this year relative to historical average. Goods traded on open account, which means that the exporter ships the goods and receives payment only later, have received a drop on the order of 27%. But flows insured by so-called letters of credit, these are instruments where for a fee, banks guarantee to the importer that the payment will be made, and to the exporter the guarantees that no payment needs to be made prior to the goods arrival, did not experience any change. Now, why does it matter? Well, it matters because relative to the times of financial crisis, the supply of trade finance is more limited now than it was 10 years ago. In order to sell instruments such as letters of credit, you often need relationships with so-called correspondent banks. And many of those relationships between banks in emerging markets and correspondent banks in developed countries have been dissolved in the past 10 years. And that's because of onerous reporting requirements associated with anti-laundering regulations and anti-terrorism regulations. And this results in lower supply of trade finance, which means that going forward, we may see an even bigger drop in trade finance that we have seen up to this point. Now, the second implication of this observation is that from the crisis, multinational firms may emerge as stronger because they do not face uncertainty. My last point pertains to remote work. Now that many firms have crossed the psychological border of remote working, why should they limit themselves to workers in their home countries? Why not go a step further and hire foreign workers? Here, there are some limitations pertaining to time zones, to data protection legislation, and travel restrictions. But nevertheless, this is an opportunity for countries that have inexpensive skilled labor to export their services. So in that sense, COVID pandemic may provide a stimulus for a different kind of globalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jaworczyk. Just a kind reminder to the audience, if you have further questions to the presentation that you have just seen or the panelists at large, please place them in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar. We now move to our next speaker, Professor Falk. In our most recent flagship publication, the UNIDO Industrial Development Report 2020, we have tried to describe and better understand the emerging technological forces likely to shape the future of manufacturing and global production networks in particular. In your view, Professor Falk, what are the likely impacts and implications of COVID-19 for industry transition towards the fourth industrial revolution?
Yes, thank you very much, Adnan. And first of all, thank you very much for having me on this first webinar on this very, very important question. It's a big honor to be with UNIDO again and the Kiel Institute. And I'm delighted to talk a little bit about this question based on the experiences that I make with the work that I do in Accenture, but also in leading this group, a group on digital business models in Industry 4.0, both in Germany and in collaboration with a set of Chinese companies. I think the push to digitalization, if you could now move to the next slide, is absolutely evident to everyone. So 300 million daily conference participants on Zoom, an uptake even in laggard industries such as healthcare or education in adopting digital technologies to ensure business continuity is really evident to each and every one of us. What is interesting, though, about this pandemic is that it has also been a tremendous catalyst and burning glass on the efficiency and effectiveness of digital infrastructure. And both companies look at that, as well as countries. And I would like to discuss this along three trends that you can see here on the slide. So first of all, the acceleration of platformization and ecosystem governance. One of sort of the key building blocks actually of sort of the fourth industrial revolution, which is predominantly about bringing together the digital and the physical world, has been evident over the course of the last couple of months. We have ourselves in our own research looked at China, who has been, as we all know, ahead of the curve. And coincidentally, we had done an in-depth survey in January that we then repeated in the April-May timeframe to look at the different patterns of technology adoption. And what we saw is an enormous uptake in cloud adoption, artificial intelligence, and analytics, as well as RPA, which is a clear indication for automation, which was just mentioned by my previous speaker. So there seems to be evidence, if we look at China, that this has received an enormous push. We also see a couple of use cases already in the industry. Klöckner, for example, who is a platform that handles, deals with equipment and tools and machinery and others, they have quadrupled. So this is sort of the addressing the demand side. And then on the supply side, we also see companies like Your Mind, which is providing on-demand 3D printing services. They have also accelerated the suppliers on their platform significantly. So we see it in the industry, and of course, what we also see is that governments are actively pushing it. China, in their China 2025 strategy, which they now call a little bit differently, aims to bring 1 million companies to the cloud. And also Germany, in its stimulus package, has allocated 1 billion to build or provide access to platforms. So that's a big sort of push, both on the industry, in and in government, to the platformization in industry. And what is very important here is that the pandemic was an opportunity for companies to learn to work together in an ecosystem. In the course of our research, we did a number of interviews with decision makers and business leaders in China, and for them, it was clearly sort of a turning point in ecosystem collaboration in China. So I believe that this trend, the move to the cloud and the move to build and establish value networks across ecosystems is set to continue. And the same applies to supply chains. I mean, the trend to supply chain diversification is not new. On the back of sort of cost increases in China, regulation, protectionism, this has started already quite some time ago. However, now with the sort of experience of economic stoppage and freeze in the physical world, sort of companies have indeed thought more about establishing just-in-case regimes in their supply chains. Is that easy? No, not at all. If you look, for example, Daimler, they have 213 suppliers, and the top 10 out of these 213 have another 488 suppliers, and those again have another 2,900. So I think the ask to bring resilience into supply chains from the perspective of an OEM is quite a task and not easy to do. And we will also have to consider that that China, if you look at the industry, this is where the innovation happens. So the innovation for the manufacturing industry is coming from that country, and therefore sort of just pulling yourself out of everything is probably not a wise decision. Some governments are actually actively pursuing the sort of bringing supply chains out of China. Japan has allocated $2 billion in their stimulus package to actually do that. But as I said, it's not an easy thing. So what we can expect here is that this diversification will happen more in the areas that have been gone on anyways in an accelerated way now. And in other industries which are far more sophisticated and with very complex sort of supply chains, this will be something that we have to watch and see how this evolves. And then last but not least, digital infrastructure, and you can see here I talk about sovereign digital infrastructure at the core, will become far more pronounced. We have in the industry since quite some time, we have talked about the risk of the lock-in, which is sort of the binding of a company to one supplier, and that was particularly discussed in the area of cloud, where sort of the service providers for European companies predominantly come out of the US. Now, the discussion is very much about the lockout. Not only about sort of being sort of economically bound to a price controlling monopoly in certain areas. No, now it's really about sort of the risk of being shut down from digital infrastructure in the future. And there have been a number of responses already. I'm sure many of you have heard about sort of Phraya X, the decentral German data infrastructure that is meant to be a European project in order to avoid the lockout effect. In China has sort of provided a huge push on their new infrastructure sort of strategy in which they aim to build 600,000 5G base stations until the end of this year, as well as multiple other things. So is that a tipping point for sort of the adoption of Industry 4.0 technologies? Certainly. However, we will see that the fourth industrial revolution is changing at the same time. We are not yet there to talk about it winners and losers, but we can certainly differentiate between countries that look into it thoughtfully and others that don't. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Phraya, for this insightful perspective on the future of manufacturing post-COVID-19. We now move to Professor Ono, and in this particular case, my question will be that the scale of the current crisis and its severe implications for global production networks are certainly unprecedented. But this is not the first crisis global value chains have to weather. If history is any indication, what policy lessons can we draw from more recent crises, and how can those lessons help us increase resilience of global production networks in the future? Professor Ono, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam. It is my great honor to have an opportunity to participate in this first series of the UNIDO and then Kiel Institute, that seminar. I would like to talk about a little bit about how we can build resilience in global production network and draw in some experience of the past supply chain disruption. So let me start. Okay, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has a very much unique features, such as it's a very deeper and global crisis, not only in that the location specific, and also very much broad and multi-sector. So it is not so easy to compare that the implication with other kind of disasters. So, and also supply chain risks differ by type of disaster and companies' position in the supply chain. But still, I feel like it is still worth visiting the experience of past experiences. So I would like to share with you maybe 3 issues. First, lessons from Great East Japan earthquake, which was March 11 in 2011, with big tsunami and also Fukushima, the nuclear power plant meltdown. Second is a lessons from Thailand floods, which also took place several months after in 2011. And then I would like to draw implications for developing countries and also industrial development cooperation. Next, please. Okay. So let me start with lessons from the Great East Japan earthquake. As many of you remember, particularly for the Japanese, it was a really difficult experiences. It was a kind of the Great East Japan earthquake hit the northern part of Japan on March 11th with a very big scale, 9.0 magnitude. And then tsunami waves are very high, exceeding 40 meters. So, and then 3 nuclear power plants in Fukushima really melted down. Many people have passed away and injured. And also this is the area where that some of the automotive industries, assembly plants, and also major manufacturers like Toyota, Nissan, Honda were actively operating. So supply chain was disrupted suddenly, and then that really had a devastating impact. Not only this area, but also that the firms and factories around the world. But despite these complex shocks, production resumed relatively quickly within 3 to 4 months. So why it has been possible? There are several researches done by Todo and also Murdoch and other researchers. Particularly Todo did a kind of the firm survey data and then looked at what are the kind of factors that the firm have coped, and also how that some of the company have done better. And then he find, while certainly that the complex supply chain networks have risks to the disruption at the kind of those kind of disaster, at the same time, these diversified networks also overall work positively. Particularly, he found out networks with firms outside the impacted area contributed to earlier resumption of production. At the same time, networks within the region contributed to sales recovery, the consumption demand in the medium term. For example, the photo here, is at the company called Renesas Electronics. It's a major producer of microcontroller of automobile. It is a world share of 40%. So many automotive companies like a Toyota, Nissan, Honda, they really use these kind of parts and components from these companies. But this company was very, production had halted. Then I think that those kind of suppliers and also Toyota, Honda, Nissan, they really work together, although they are rival, but they work together to help the company to rebuild. And then it was really in a short term that they are able to resume the operation. So these are one of the kind of example how networks within farm outside the impacted area contributed to earlier resumption of production. Also, another survey shows that the importance of business continuity plan preparation. Of course, large and medium enterprises had much more prepared in this kind of thing. And then small and medium enterprises are less prepared. But when you compare with those companies who have had the BCP, they answered those are very much effective in the response and also recovery phase. Okay. Next, please. Okay. Then let me share with you another experiences. That is a Thailand flood in Chao Phraya River, which took place in August and December 2011. I think this river sometimes flooded, but this 2011 one is a major flooding experiences. And then of course, many Thai companies were affected. At the same time, as you imagine that there are many Japanese investors are working there in Thailand. It's a really huge agglomeration of automotive and other manufacturing companies. So in that affected area, about 60% of firms, almost 100, that were forced to cut production. And then that also kind of contributed to disrupting the supply chain globally, particularly in the United States. And 70% of that affected kind of companies resorted to alternative production, utilizing their network, particularly in Japan, and some in other places, Thailand, and some in China. Particularly because many companies resorted to utilize alternative production in Japan, Japanese kind of companies and also together with the government decided to kind of accept that receive Thai employees in the flooded Japanese factory area. So they are allowed to send to Japan as a temporary workers, as visa, those things. So they are able to continue operation, and also they even taught the Japanese young workers how to do manufacturing on the ground, because Thai engineers have very much acquired very good technology and skill that in Japanese style monozukuri. it is very much interesting to know that after maybe several months in that questionnaires survey, many Japanese companies responded. They would like to continue working in Thailand, not leaving the countries, even after the flood. And also, after several years, that Thailand received even more outward FDI from Japan, particularly SME, which were affected by Great East Japan earthquake, directly or indirectly. Because this earthquake really, as explained, that caused the supply chain disruption, and also maybe power shortage because of that Fukushima that the nuclear power plants were not functional. And also together with shrinking market, much of a structural problem that which Japan faced in the aging society, more or less workers, together with many factors. Many Japanese companies, particularly SME, decided to go abroad, and they chose Thailand to be the one of the places, together with Vietnam. So Thailand received even more outward FDI. Could you go to next? Okay. And then to this Thai flood, it is interesting to share with you that what kind of cooperation Japan offered in industrial development cooperation, because the country has been an important manufacturing partner for Japan as a hub of automotive production in ASEAN. So the Japanese government, together with the private sector, responded quickly to provide various support services. And also not only in the immediate short term, but also kind of supported for the further upgrading of the infrastructure capability and human resource upgrading. These measures include, as I wrote, some consultation services, information sharing with Thai government, financial support, short-term and long-term in various sorts. And also, as I said, the Thai engineers was accepted in Japan as a trainees until that operation in Thailand resumed. And then also they got some employment permission in the Japanese companies, and some of them also received the training for further upgrading locally and also in Japan. So I think this kind of continuity that the company did not have to kind of fire that the people when that the production site is idle. Also infrastructure improvement, much more upgrading visibility, higher standard of industrial park, and also networking between Japanese, Thai business, kind of business matching. Those are really also useful. Next, please. So implication for developing countries. I think these two experiences, although this is different from COVID, but that show the importance of diversified supply chain networks and also business continuity plan preparation. And this is purely, I think, private sector effort matters. At the same time, I think Beata-san talked a lot about that. I think in the evolving a new GVC landscape in post-pandemic world, we don't know what will be a new shape, but this may be an opportunity for developing countries because some company may be diversifying their kind of production bases and supply chain more. So that those countries which want to seize just opportunities from changing pattern of that supply chain trend to be more integrated in GVC, they can pursue with better investment climate policies, infrastructure investment, education, skill development, public health, etc. At the country level, a Thai experience shows, even after the flood, they have maintained or even strengthened its position to attract FDI thanks to accumulated industrial human resources and also industrial agglomeration. And in this sense, I would like to really emphasize also Thai government itself, that their public policy, like a board of investment, it is investment promotion agency, and also the Ministry of Industry, they really worked together. As I see that this kind of orange is board of investment, and also blue is a kind of agency or bureau in Ministry of Industry. They really work together in making a strategic attraction of FDI. And also BOI has a kind of unit called BUILD to have a business matching between foreign partners and also local partners. And also blue part, that means the industry had a kind of policies to strengthen that supporting industry. I think so those things actually worked nicely in collaboration with developing partners. Okay, next slide. Okay, finally, we are talking about the post-COVID, but I think we must find a way to coexist, at least for time being, with a virus. So I think a new normal situation, we have to really change our behavioral change beyond efficiencies. It's not just kind of, so it's really our mindset, behavioral change required. For that purpose, I think we need to build effective public-private partnership for human-centered approach. And I think this includes both traditional basic instrument and also innovative instrument. For example, for the basic instrument, I think we have a Kaizen, that is a continuous improvement of factory floor, or that the organization from the top to all the workers working together, sharing their ideas to improve their kind of operation, that the process of work. It's a kind of all participatory approach. And this is kind of 5S we call, maybe we can also include those kind of human kind of safety issues, healthy issues, and much more kind of labor types of things too. So we can really utilize Kaizen in the kind of context of COVID too. And also more innovative approach, we can really strengthen responsible financing for the companies to really driving the business toward resilient society. For example, some Japanese kind of banks have business continuity management rated loan, so which has a kind of risk assessing the companies according to the preparedness of those kind of disaster risks. And then depending on their preparedness, they can offer the favorable financing for them. So it's a kind of the ESG financing too. So I think we have to really think about how can build effective public-private partnership for human-centered approach with a behavior change. So I also found that the very kind of valuable kind of remarks by Singapore foreign minister, which talk about in good times, just-in-time supply chain were considered to be the most efficient, but now we have to develop just-in-case supply chain for the sake of resilience, which is really echo that the better presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ono, and we appreciate you staying up late, in fact, to be with us here today. It was an honor. Thank you very much. We now turn to our last panelist, Professor Ha-Joon Chang. You have spent a great deal of your academic career advancing our thinking and knowledge about the role of industrialization, among other factors, in fostering economic development. In your view, what does COVID-19 and the early lessons we are drawing from the crisis mean for the future of industrialization and industrial policy making in particular? Professor Chang, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adnan. Thank you to everyone at the UNIDO for inviting me to this great event, and thank you everyone attending this webinar. Yeah, before going into discussion about how the pandemic and its aftermath are going to affect industrialization in developing countries, let me just sketch out, of course, at this stage, who can tell for sure, but let me just sketch out three main changes that I think the world of production and especially global value chains is going to experience. Well, first of all, there'll be reorganization of production method. You know, we all know that face-to-face services will have to radically reorganize, and as a result, many of them will be much more expensive than before, because you cannot fill theaters to capacity, restaurants to capacity. You cannot have as many people in the shops at the same time as before. There'll be, as Professor Jaworczyk pointed out, there'll be increase in online business services. And thirdly, there'll be reorganization of production in labor-intensive manufacturing, like garment, food processing. In the US, in Germany, meat processing factories have been important sources of infection. Basically, these are industries where a lot of workers are crammed in the small spaces. So they'll have to reorganize production. Now, many people very quickly move on from there to predict great automation. But the thing about automation is that it's expensive. I mean, you need to develop the technology, you need to buy the machines. I'm sure there'll be some more automation prompted by this, but I very much doubt that this will, in a major way, lead to automation and replace workers, especially in developing countries like, say, garment making workers in Bangladesh. In some industries, the problem could be relatively easily solved by having bigger space. In garment making, where you are not necessarily running a production line, the individual workers can be spaced out more. I mean, of course, it will make it more expensive because you need bigger factory space, but you can't solve this without automation. So, while I agreeing that there'll be some more automation, I'm not sure how much there will be. So that's the first thing, reorganization of production itself. And then I think there'll be recomposition of activities. Basically, as I just mentioned, face-to-face services will be either more expensive or totally unavailable. And of course, with the generally lower demand level, the absolute level of material production in manufacturing, agriculture, mining is lower, but in relative terms, those sectors producing material goods will see their demand increasing because people will necessarily consume less of face-to-face services. And probably the manufactured goods that partially compensate for the unavailability of those services might see a surge in demand. If you cannot go to restaurants, you might buy more cooking gadgets. If you cannot go on foreign tourism, you might invest in getting the high definition displays and maybe even virtual reality equipment. And with the increase in the usage of those things, the manufacturers making servers and broadband equipment to provide greater entertainment at home, greater efficiency of working from home, they might also see surge in demand. So there'll be recomposition of demand. I am sure there are lots of other things that are going to happen, but these are some examples. And finally, there'll be reorganization of global value chains. I think it's a fantasy to talk about major reshoring, because in many countries, the industrial ecosystems that you need in order to have some industries have already been destroyed. I'm sure that they can be rebuilt, but it'll be extremely costly. So while on the margin, there might be some relocation of manufacturing to home base in countries where the ecosystems have not been totally destroyed. Many sectors in countries like the US and the UK, even if they wanted, cannot relocate production. But there will be some reorganization of GVCs. I think that there might be some attempts to simplify the chains at the cost of at the cost of having higher production costs. Professor Falk and other speakers have already talked about diversification of production bases. And even if you're not controlling those bases. You may diversify procurement sources. Now, whether these are going to take the form of nearshoring, so to speak, I'm not so sure, because if you are worried about pandemic shocks from climate change, it might be actually safer to spread your sources to faraway places which are not so in close contact and not so much under the same influence of nature. So I cannot say I can predict how it's going to happen, but yes, some simplification, some diversification. But once again, I mean, all of this, as Professor Phraya pointed out, all of these are costly. So how much are these things going to happen? I think it will depend on the industry, depend on the country, and the evolution of production technologies. Now, how are all these going to affect developing countries? Well, one short sentence answer is that the impacts will be very different across industry, across countries. And the differential impacts will depend on a number of things. The first is your existing pattern of specialization. Those countries that specialize in labor-intensive manufacturing, like Bangladesh, they are going to be very hard hit, at least in the short to medium run. If you are specialized in more capital-intensive manufacturing or the mining or agricultural production, you will be less hard hit. Secondly, how different countries and industries are going to be affected will be influenced by how much and where transnational corporations decide to rearrange their global value chains. So, this is at one level something beyond the control of developing countries. But on the other hand, this means that developing countries need to become more active in their management of foreign direct investment in the way countries like Singapore, Ireland, Costa Rica, and as Professor Ono just pointed out, Thailand have been. Because there are many countries which think that having a liberalized foreign direct investment regime is enough. Well, I mean, history has proven that that's not the best way to manage foreign direct investment. You need to identify strategic sectors, target particular companies, talk to them, build the necessary infrastructure, supply the necessary skills and so on, and work with them. That's how you attract high quality investment. And I mean, that kind of strategy will be more necessary because now, there'll be, once again, I'm not saying that there'll be a whole upheaval, but there'll be a lot of scramble for, diversifying sources and diversifying procurement sources and diversifying production base. And then new windows of opportunities will open, but potentially there are 140 countries that want a piece of action there. Who are the firms going to come to? Countries that are more proactive. Yeah? The differential impacts will also depend on your productive capabilities. As a rule, if you have higher productive capabilities, you are better able to adapt to new conditions. But most importantly, how the leading agents, the government and major firms, domestic and foreign, deal with the situation will determine how things evolve for these countries. On this point, let me talk about a few interesting examples and then conclude my presentation. Some developing countries have shown quite a bit of agility in terms of industrial policy during this crisis. You know, Ethiopia has had this very successful state-owned airline with Ethiopian Airlines, which are seeing the demand for passenger traffic collapse, talked to Boeing and Airbus and converted many of their passenger flights to cargo flights by reconfiguring the planes. And I'm told that they are doing very good business. South African companies are producing masks for the mining industry, has also repurposed some of its production. So, you know, already there are countries that have shown greater agility in dealing with this crisis. But also, interestingly, there are countries that have discovered, if you like, hidden capabilities. You know, a recent OECD report that mentioned that Egypt has developed a test kit. You know, most people would not have thought of Egypt as a country that would develop this, but there are also many African countries, Ghana, Uganda, and so on, that are trying to develop their test kits. Nigeria apparently has developed a local ventilator, you know. So some countries are finding these hidden capabilities. And there have been, at least in Africa, some very interesting development in terms of international cooperation, because the African countries have grouped together to organize basically collective procurement of personal protection equipment, because these countries are typically very small, and they found the huge potential for cost saving in the bulk purchase. And then Ethiopian Airlines, South African Airlines, they are shipping things across the continent. Who knows? I mean, this might be a beginning of the Pan-African coordination in some areas of trade and industrial policies, coming on top of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So yeah, I think there are a lot of very interesting developments going on, but essentially the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, even relatively weak developing countries like Ethiopia and so on have, you know, shown that a lot can change depending on what you do. So I think it's a great opportunity to think about industrial policy again, nationally and across borders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chang, for providing these useful insights into what countries can do or are actually doing in responding to the crisis. Unfortunately, we are slightly over the time, so I would not go into individual questions that the audience has asked. Indeed, there were quite a number of them, and our panelists have seen all of them. So instead, what I would like to do is maybe give each panelist the opportunity to, for a short summary or wrap up, literally 1 minute. And if you like, you can also pick on some of the questions that may have been addressed to you in the Q&A section. Maybe starting with Beata.
So I would like to draw attention to policy. During the financial crisis, we were worried about emergence of protectionism. It did not happen because early on, G20 issued a statement expressing strong commitment to free trade. We have not seen such a statement this time. And there is a danger that the world will sleepwalk into protectionism. This could very easily happen, as under the WTO rules, it is legal to use countervailing duties against subsidized imports. And this day and age, when every country helps its national firms, it will be very easy to make a case that such imports are subsidized. So we need international commitment to free trade to avoid an increase in protectionism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jaworczyk. Professor Falk?
So the pandemic has very clearly shown the importance of digital infrastructure. I believe that it is now clear that it has moved to the heart of a country's competitiveness. But there's only a very, very small number of countries that really think strategically and holistically across the whole technology stack, hardware, software, ecosystem, cloud, components, and raw materials. But I believe that this will start very soon. And it's very important for Europe to find its own way in this. And I think it's very well positioned to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Falk. Professor Ono, over to you. 1 minute, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I got several questions regarding maybe Japanese companies leaving China or something like that. I think it depends. I think most of the companies continue to stay in China. Plus, we talk about China plus one, or maybe even Thailand plus one. So they are trying to diversify the investment kind of the destination. But I think these things are not happening just because of COVID. There are already those kind of trends are already going on because China's labor cost is rising, and also China-US trade war. These are making that the kind of that the investors are making the urge to think about several kind of diversifying the portfolio. So it's a bit difficult to say that what is the factor directly coming from COVID-19. But I think many investors still continue to live in China because it's a very big market, and also they are very, very much diversified kind of the industrial basis and scale. So I don't think that those sudden maybe that change will happen. And one maybe last remark is that we don't know yet what will be the new landscape of global value chain would be in the post or with Corona. At the same time, for the kind of that the agency like JICA, we are working for international cooperation. I think we also, it is very important to go back to basics. I think it's very important to support the developing countries or emerging countries to strengthen their capacities to attract strategically opportunities for that the good investor to coming in, and then how to develop those kind of strategies, industrial strategies, and also how to support matching with the local companies through technology transfer. I think whatever kind of that the landscape of GVC kind of changes, I think those kind of basic kind of capacity building is very much important. So I think we really have to continue to working on this. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor Ono. And finally, Professor Chang, any final remarks from your side?
Thank you. This crisis unprecedented and involves very high degrees of uncertainty. So I think this is the time when everyone should try to learn from everyone else. And who has come out well, at least in terms of the health crisis management, is not what you would have predicted before the crisis. I mean, Vietnam has officially 0 deaths, you know. I mean, the so-called advanced countries have floundered. So, no, I'm not saying that there are necessarily better countries than others, but you know, I think in terms of what countries have done, what sectors have done, what firms have done, I think there are a lot of lessons that we need to learn from each other. And I think in that vein, I think UNIDO could lead some kind of knowledge bank, you know, how countries have adapted their production structure, how companies have started reorganizing their global value chains, and make it publicly available so that we can quickly absorb this new knowledge and deal with this situation better. So that was more of a kind of plea to the UNIDO rather than the comment on the seminar, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chang. We take this as a valuable comment and recommendation on board. Your intervention also marks the end of our first webinar. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank our speakers and panelists for their time and valuable insights they've provided into the ongoing debate. I would also like to thank my colleagues at UNIDO and our partners at the Kiel Institute who have made this event possible. And last but not least, thanks to the audience for tuning in. I hope you have enjoyed it and that you will join us for the future editions of UNIDO's webinar series on the future of industrialization in a post-pandemic world. Stay healthy and goodbye.